information about the hospital. There's a lot of things happening, especially this year. We have a lot of new clinics that will be opening. And as I go through this, if you do have questions, I'll be happy to answer them. But just to talk a little bit about kind of the agenda about Gritman, the healthcare landscape, which is ever changing. Every day there's a new article that we're trying to keep up with. Some of the services, the partnerships, and in the future of healthcare. So just to give a little history about Gritman Medical Center, it was actually started by Dr. Charles Gritman back in the late 1800s, right on the corner of 7th and Main Street in what was called the McGregor Hotel. They converted it to a hospital. His wife was a nurse, and so they cared for the community. They actually went out and did home visits. He retired in 1933, and unfortunately, shortly after that, he passed away. And his wife, Bertie, gave the hospital essentially to the community with a covenant it had a forever bearers meet. So we're very proud to be serving this community for over 120 years. That is a picture of the McGregor house. There's a picture of Dr. Gritman. So our mission is to really provide extraordinary care to improve the health of the people in our community. So healthcare has changed. Hospitals have changed in the sense of what our mission is. It used to be we were caring for people when they're sick. We're really trying to care for people on the wellness side, and you'll see that in some of our services that we have here. So a little bit about how we're designated. So there's two different designations that we look at. One is from the IRS. We're a not-for-profit community hospital, so it doesn't mean we don't make a profit. We put that profit back into the organization in the form of services, employees, bringing new equipment in, and keeping up on the technology. And the other one is by Medicare and Medicaid. So CMS regulates hospitals, and so you can be structured differently. Under CMS, we're a critical access hospital. And to tell you a little bit about what that means, so when I first started at the hospital, we were called a prospective payment system hospital, so I knew exactly how I was going to get paid from Medicare on a patient based on their diagnosis. In 2004, we were able to convert to a critical access hospital. What that meant from a patient perspective is nothing changed. So if you came in when we were a PPS to a critical access, it didn't change that. We do have a limit on how many inpatient beds, but I'll show you a graph on what's happening on our inpatient side. So we don't bump up against that 25 bed limit very often in there, and we have strategies to help with that. As far as hospital stay, you have to have a patient to be only in there for 96 hours. Our average length of stay is about 3 days in there, so we're well below that. We have to have an emergency department 24/7, which we already had. But the way we get paid is we get paid what's called 101% of allowable costs. So I would say I describe it as, it's kind of like your tax return. There's certain costs that you can claim, there's certain costs you can't claim. And Medicare takes out those costs. I'll give you a couple examples. Marketing is one that we don't claim that cost. Unless you're really educating the patient regarding the services, then you can claim that. If not, then they disallow that. Phones in the patient rooms, TVs in the patient rooms are non-allowable costs, and Medicare views that as it doesn't help that patient get better, so they're not going to allow that. However, we do have patient TVs and phones, so we take out that cost. So that's a little bit different structure. The other hospitals, some were mentioning, talking about St. Joe's. St. Joe's is a for-profit hospital. The other four in our area, Pullman, Colfax, Tri-State, they're all critical access. To talk a little bit about some of the changes, Medicaid expansion in Idaho. If you read the paper, every day it seems like there's a new article or a new sidebar that's happening down there. From our perspective, because we're a not-for-profit 501c, we obviously take care of all patients that come to our door. And what Medicaid expansion would mean for the hospital is helping with some of the bad debt charities. So we care for these individuals. So just to give some comparison, I put Pullman Hospital there for a reason. Pullman Hospital and Gritman are very similar. We use a lot of the same doctors. A lot of our physicians practice at both hospitals, and a lot of specialty doctors. Our payer mix is very much the same, and our communities are pretty much the same. But Washington expanded in 2013. So these are 2018 numbers, not audited on either entity. But you can see that Pullman's bad debt in charity was about $2.5 million. Our bad debt was $3.5, not including the charity of $1.9 million. So as we compete and as we try to bring in services, that is a challenge for our hospital as far as doing that. Medicaid expansion will help. On some of it, it won't go away, just like Pullman's not seeing that part go away. So I mentioned on the financial piece and talking about that 25 bed census, what you can see on this graph is a decline on the inpatient side. And that's happening for a variety of reasons. Technology is changing. So patients that used to come in for a gallbladder removal, they used to stay 2 days. They don't stay, they're an outpatient. And so that's affecting those admissions. The other line, the blue line on there that you can see here, this is observation. So there's different statuses that you can come into the hospital. If you are saying they think you're having a heart attack and they need to observe you and check your labs, you actually get admitted as an observation patient. You're not an admission. In admission, you have to stay at the hospital for 24 hours or longer. An observation is less than 24 hours. And then we started a program back in 2016 called Swing Bed. Swing Bed is a designation similar to a skilled nursing facility. So you have to be at the hospital for that 3-day inpatient stay. But essentially what we were seeing is some of our skilled nursing facilities in our area weren't able to take on some of our patients. We brought that program back, especially for those patients that just needed a couple days. They didn't need to go to a skilled nursing facility. They were able to stay. It is different. It's a different designation. There's different care plans that happen under Swing Bed, and it was a need in our community that we started that. From an outpatient visit, as we shift from inpatient to outpatient, you can see this is where we've seen a lot of our growth. This growth that you see right here is essentially us taking on the Moscow Family Medicine Clinic. So that's the huge jump in there, and I'll talk a little bit about that. But we usually see about 2 to 3% increase in our outpatient visits. And that's new services coming on, those services that are going from an inpatient to an outpatient is where we see them. From an operating margin, I can tell you hospitals, it's a challenging time. It continues to be a challenging time on the operation side. So this is 15, 16, and 17, which are these years. You can see the benchmark. So the benchmark here is Idaho and Washington data. And then we have Idaho. So most Idaho hospitals, especially critical access, are actually usually in the red. Gritman has been pretty fortunate. We've been able to operate and have a small operating margin, but you can see in 2015 we were about 2.4. In 2018 we were at 0.73. And the reason for some of that is some of the labor costs that I'll talk about here in just a minute and some of the challenges we're having in our industry. So we do have small margins. But again, we try to put that back into our services. From a total margin, essentially what you can see is a lot of change and flux. This is mainly due to our investments. If you looked at your investments in December and it tanked, so did the hospitals. And so that's where a lot of this, it's an unrealized gain or loss on our investments, mainly an accounting piece. It's come back up, but that was a change for us. Patient deductions. So patient deductions, if any of you look at your explanation of benefits and you see the hospital charge and you see the stuff that is not reimbursed, what that means is we had a contract with that payer. Obviously I don't contract with Medicare. Medicare tells me how they're going to pay us, and the same as Medicaid. But Blue Cross and Regents and those, we negotiate contracts. And so for every dollar essentially that we charge, we essentially write off about half right now. And that comes in the form of some of that charity care and bad debt, but mainly those contractuals that come in. And you can see that some of that benchmark up to 63%, some of the Idaho hospitals, some of them don't have orthopedic. Orthopedic, there's a larger write-off piece on it. So one thing we've been focused on at the hospital is looking at how we define our customers. And one of our customers that we feel is very important is our employees. We are the largest private employer in Moscow. We have about 540 employees. And one of the things that we focus on is their satisfaction. Obviously, if we have happy employees, then we have happy patients, and we can continue to do our mission. And so there's three things that we really look at. Overall satisfaction. So in last May when we surveyed our employees and we surveyed all of them. We got about 70% to fill out the survey, which is great, because then it's statistically valid for us. Our overall satisfaction went up to 91% from 88%. Job engagement and organizational engagement, according to HealthStreams, who helped survey those, are the ones that really tell, how engaged are your employees in the organization and wanting to make change. And so that is a more crucial thing for us to look at. And what we want to be at the 90th percentile or better, which is essentially the top 10 of the hospitals out there. And last year, under organizational engagement, we were at 94, job engagement, we were at 90. So our employees are truly engaged in how we essentially roll out strategies, care for our patients, and provide our services. So let's talk a little bit about healthcare and the landscape. I can tell you, and when I was in school and thinking about what I wanted to do, I wanted to make sure that I had an impact on what my job was. Obviously, as an accountant, I didn't want to just focus on the bottom line. That was not an interest to me. And I actually was a junior volunteer growing up in Idaho Falls for about 2.5 years. It was a great experience for me, really liked it. So, and one thing I didn't want to get into is taxes. Taxes are complicated, they change all the time. So I decided to jump into healthcare, which, at 22, 23 at the time, that was a great idea. I can tell you our healthcare system is complicated. And here is an actual flow chart that our government put together that shows our healthcare system. So some of you are familiar with doing flow charts. This is probably the most complicated flow chart I have ever seen. And essentially, hospitals and physicians are down in this corner. So if you think about healthcare, it is a very complicated and regulated industry, more so than I ever expected. And so when you think about cost, when you have that complication in there, that helps drive up the cost. But Medicare, CMS, which is this entity, essentially they work with Congress to come up with the regulations. CMS carries that out, we follow CMS, and there's obviously a lot of input that happens in our healthcare system. And it's ever changing. So we constantly are keeping up with what's happening in our industry. As I mentioned, if you're reading the papers, there's a lot of activity in healthcare for good reason. There's a lot of costs in healthcare in there. But I would say, looking at this, it is a challenging industry to be in. So what are some of the challenges that are facing our healthcare system? So in Idaho ranks 49th in the number of physicians per capita. So some of you might know that our country is actually in a physician shortage. So the challenges that we have in the healthcare system are going to be made worse by trying to have physicians. And there's two reasons for that. One is we have the baby boomers coming into the healthcare system and needing more healthcare. The Affordable Care Act trying to focus on access, but they didn't address the physician shortage. So what they're saying is by 2020, that we will have a shortage in our country of about 90,000 physicians. So some of our partnerships that we're working on is obviously with our WWAMI program here. So that is a challenge, and it's going to continue to be a challenge. Changes in the healthcare environment. It's constantly changing. I thought taxes were going to be hard. Healthcare is harder to keep up on some of those changes. The potential loss of the critical access designation. President Obama actually had some stuff in his budget where they wanted to get rid of that. And so we're constantly looking at how our reimbursement is. Our revenues won't cover inflation. So as those margins get thinner, it's really hard to continue your mission as a hospital to meet the needs of your community. And Medicaid expansion for us has been challenging.